government to do that. The government should open a debate far from accepting the emotional polarization that they have in the society. It should be the voice of wisdom and not take responsibility of something that it's not the responsibility of the state.
Let me ask you about a different kind of example then. The Al-Qaeda videotapes that are broadcast by Al Jazeera, the Arab television station, are frequently not published. In fact, they're mostly not broadcast in the West. Do you think that it is right for television stations to broadcast menacing videos and videos of victims being beheaded?
I totally agree with the fact that as we are speaking about reasonable use of our means in the name of freedom of speech, is exactly the same with journalists. And I think that Al Jazeera is doing the wrong job here. They are sometimes promoting something which is a irresponsible way of dealing with journalism, and they are counterproductive. They are not helping us at all. I really think that it's a political issue, and that we have to ask the Muslims throughout the world, as we have to ask our fellow citizens in Europe, stay and remain wise and do not accept this kind of polarization. We have common values and we can do more together than what is happening now.
Professor Ramadan, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Professor A.C. Grayling, who's Professor of Philosophy at Burke College, London. Professor Grayling, in your view, what do you think is basically at stake here?
I think what's fundamentally at stake for people in the West is this extremely important freedom, the freedom of speech, which is the basic civil liberty, because without it you can't have any others. You can't have democracy unless people can exchange information, argue, challenge one another. You couldn't, for example, have a due process of law unless people were able to speak freely in a court of law to accuse or to defend themselves. You couldn't really have education unless people were free to get information, to ask questions, to dispute things that they disagree with. And so this is a very, very deeply important freedom for us in the West.
And it's an unqualified freedom in your view, is it?
Well, I think there are qualifications to the freedom of speech because there are certain...
But they don't cover this particular instance?
I don't think they cover this particular instance, no.
Stephen Rose, your witness.
I wonder, Professor Grayling, whether you ever saw the cartoons that appeared in the Nazi press in the 1930s, caricatures of Jews showing them as parasites, showing them as money bags, showing them as sapping the personality and the possibility of the German race. Did you ever see any of those?
I have seen some of those, yes.
And would you have agreed that those should have been published?
I think they were absolutely obscene, and what they showed was that the people who drew them and the people who put them out were nauseating.
No, but you haven't answered my question. Should they have been published?
I think that if they had been published in a liberal democracy, yes, they should, and they should have been countered ferociously by people who thought that they were disgusting.
But can you also understand that those of us whose families died in the camps could actually see those cartoons as part of a direct route to those camps?
Yes, I can see that too, and I think that the evidence that they contained, that there was a serious danger of that kind, ought to have made people stand up and argue against it. You know the old saying, don't you, that it's enough for good people to do nothing,
Indeed.
that evil will prevail, and that's what happened in that case.
Indeed. So it would have been okay to publish them in Britain, but it wasn't okay to publish them in Nazi Germany. That's what you're saying.
No, I didn't say that. Nazi Germany...
Well, this is a liberal democracy here, isn't it?
This is a liberal democracy, certainly, and had it happened here, I'm sure that people would have stood up and said that they found them disgusting and unacceptable. In Nazi Germany, there wasn't a liberal democracy.
Would it have been
they therefore showed that there was a serious danger to people who were members of the Jewish faith.
So what you're saying is it's okay to publish, but it's okay to protest after they've been published, but nonetheless, the consequences of publishing something like that doesn't matter to you?
The consequences certainly matter. But I think that the point that's really important here is that when these things are published, and that the prospective freedom for anybody to put a view, however much you might dislike it and disagree with it, it trumps the idea that you should, before something is published, silence somebody because you think you're not going to like it. I mean, you use an example which is very similar to this one, of course, and has a very particular resonance for us. But the general principle is the thing that's at stake here.
Yes, but you can't deal with general principles without looking at their application in practice. And in practice, you are actually, in this context, publishing something which is deeply offensive to an ethnic minority, dangerous to them, in an environment which is actually sort of in many ways racist.
Well, let's look at the consequence of doing what you imply should be done, and that is to stop people from publishing such things or saying such things in advance. where would that end? I mean, if a political party said that it wasn't going to accept any challenges or any offensive remarks because its feelings were offended by it, we would find ourselves in a situation where free speech of any kind would be impossible.
Clifford Longley, a witness.
Isn't there a failure, Professor Grayling, of the imagination among Western intellectuals to understand precisely what it is that is so offensive among Muslims? And isn't this perhaps part of Western intellectuals' failure really to get inside the religious mind? There's a kind of growing gap between secular intelligentsia on the one hand and religious believers of all kinds on the other.
I don't think so, for this reason, that we can all of us be offended and sometimes very deeply offended by things. For example, I'm sure there are many Western intellectuals who are offended today by some of the placards that were held up by protesters saying that those who had drawn the cartoon should be massacred or their hands should be cut off. Or we see the evidence today of people calling the bombers of the 7th of July.
I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you on that point at all.
The point I'm making, however, is that we understand what it is to be offended. Now, I might be profoundly offended by those things, but I wouldn't for a moment dream of suggesting violence.
Yeah, but you're not a religious person yourself, are you?
No.
Consequently, it isn't easy, is it, to see yourself in the shoes of someone with the deeply held religious beliefs that Muslims have about, for example, the way in which images of Muhammad have been surrounded historically by a kind of wall of taboo that prevents them from being desecrated, as it were, necessary to the structure of the religion. If you like, it's a fundamental part of the ecology of Islam that certain things, a very simple religion and therefore only few things, have to be protected in this way. Otherwise it begins to collapse on itself.
One sees that and appreciates that these are very, very deep sensitivities and that people do feel very upset about it. One recognises that fact. Very often, of course, in cases of dilemma of this kind, what you have are two points of view which have their justifications. This is exactly just such a case. But I think that even in a situation where people can be understood to be terribly upset, the profound principle at stake, in the West at any rate, that is the free speech one, is the one that I think has to be defended.
Ian Hargreaves.
I agree with you that free speech is fundamental to democracy and much else. You listed some of the other things, but are you saying that you, if you were a newspaper editor in Britain now, would go out of your way to publish these cartoons in order to stand shoulder to shoulder on that principle with other newspaper editors?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think that by this juncture, of course, the cat is well out of the bag, and the situation has gone well beyond the original cartoons.
So, what reasoning would restrain you? Well, what's behind the self-restraint that you would feel?
Well, I don't know that it would be a matter of restraint at this juncture. I mean, at an earlier juncture, perhaps, if a newspaper had published some cartoons and had been subject to attacks, one might very well have printed them to show solidarity, to show that even if, as you might say when you printed them, you thought they were in bad taste or you thought that they were ill-timed or something, that nevertheless the principle at stake was such that it was worth defending.
But if the principle is of such high value, there's still value in a British newspaper publishing these cartoons even now. It's not happened in a British newspaper. Do you think that's regrettable?
Well, I think that there's been plenty of discussion on both sides of the argument in British newspapers. The images themselves are, in a sense, now almost neither here nor there. The point being debated at the moment is the issue of principle, and that's the one which has had a very thorough airing so far. We're giving it one now.
Stephen Rose?
It seems to me that your argument about principle is completely indifferent to the consequences of that principle. I take it on this basis that you're opposed to legislation restricting race hate speech, religious hate speech and so on in Britain today, even that might actually constrain or prevent British Nazis and British fascists from speaking openly.
Well, actually, I'm not indifferent to the
Free
consequences.
platform for everyone.
I think that the consequences of preventing people from putting points of view, even if we don't like hearing what they have to say, are much more serious than the consequences of publishing cartoons.
Oh, Professor Grayling, what do you think would be the consequences if we did have a society in which we did either have censorship or censored ourselves from making potentially offensive remarks to a group such as the Muslims?
Well, we don't need to speculate because we have the whole weight of history to teach us what it's like when whole peoples live under gags. And indeed there are plenty of societies contemporary with us now where people live under gags. And it's been a very, very hard-won achievement in the West to try to tear these gags off so that we can discuss with one another. And I think we've learned that free speech, which may sometimes be offensive and upsetting, is only best countered by more free speech.
Professor Grayling, thanks very much indeed. Our next witness is